So welcome. Western Mindfulness 101, and our topic tonight is how to choose peace, love, and joy as a way of life. Thank you for joining me tonight, and how lovely that we've got people from all sorts of places around the world joining us tonight. So it's really, really appreciated. So you kind of think that peace, love, and joy could be an important priority now because of what we see going on in the world in terms of a lot of the different stresses that are taking place globally. However, peace, love, and joy as a way of life has been something that people have wanted probably for as long as human beings have had some form of consciousness. And so what we're going to be talking about tonight is what it takes to have peace, love, and joy as a way of life. Where I'm going to start is with a little video um, done by a company called Centus, who sort of basically do workplace safety type stuff, and they've graciously given us permission to use their videos. And this one's on conscious versus subconscious thinking. And I'll show it first and then we'll talk about it because I think it only goes for 2 minutes, but it gives enough of an idea for us, a starting point for us as we move forward.
Our brain requires a great deal of energy to operate, particularly when we have to concentrate and think about something. Problem solving or making a decision not only uses more brain energy, it also can be a slow process. So our brain seeks to conserve energy by developing efficient ways of operating. One way it does this is through conscious and subconscious processing. Our brain seeks to automate much of what we do to save us time and brain energy. These are our brain's subconscious processes. They take care of our basic life functioning, our fight or flight response, and our learned behaviors and habits. We don't really think about these things. They just happen on autopilot or have become second nature. In fact, up to 95% of all our behaviors and reactions happen at the subconscious level. Our subconscious is also involved in the recording and storing of our experiences and knowledge, forming our memories. These are stored in our brain like photos in a picture album, which we can refer back to later. The way we think and feel about these experiences forms a frame around the photo. This is how we give people, objects, or events meaning. Over time, this is how our attitudes develop. For the most part, our subconscious processes help us navigate the world efficiently. Yet sometimes we might develop unhelpful habits or attitudes that prevent us from achieving our goals. This is where more conscious thinking can benefit us. Our conscious processing involves our higher thinking capacity, where we can be more mindful and considered in what we think, feel, and do. We can use conscious thinking to reprogram our subconscious and change our thoughts, attitudes, and habits. While thinking consciously takes more energy, it is how we take greater control of our brain and achieve our goals.
So how we use our brain, I mean, really that's what that whole video was about, was this whole notion that we mostly function from two states of consciousness. One is from a state of subconsciousness, and then we have our conscious states. Of course, there's a third state, which is unconscious, but we don't function when we're unconscious traditionally. Now, it was interesting, the statistics that they talked about there. So one of the things that they talked about is that 95% of our brain's function is subconscious. Now, research has shown, and this is quite well documented, that 62% of out of our functioning is habits that, being not aware, don't have any benefit. They're things that we do that just purely have no specific benefit of any kind. So you kind of think, wow, 38, we're only using 38% of our consciousness to function in the world. And there's so much of who we are that's not even having an opportunity to be involved and expressed in our experience. The other one was beneficial habits that we have, and this represents 33% of how we function in terms of brain function. So it's still habitual. So these are things that we do out of habit, but they're habits that are serving us. So there's a huge difference between, it's nearly a half of our habits that are not beneficial. We're only using the equivalent to half of that in terms of beneficial choices, where we're actually doing things where we create habits that serve us. And of course, what they talked about in the movie that in terms of being mostly aware, and awareness is when we are aligned with our dreams and aspirations in terms of our desires and the things that we want to be able to achieve. The 33% has some sort of association with that, but in terms of being mostly aware, that's only going on in our world for most people 5% of the time. And I suspect in some people it's less than that. But people who practice mindfulness and awareness, obviously it's going to be more than that. But you can see that in terms of how we live our lives, most of us are continuing to live our lives um, um, in habit, doing habitual things. And of course, the reason we do that is it's economical, as it said in that film. What happens is it's when we do things habitually, it's easy to get things done. I mean, can you imagine if you had to, every time you hopped into a car, you had to go through the process of relearning how to drive a car? Or if you got out of bed in the morning, learning how to walk again. I mean, we know some people who have brain injury and that go through that process. So what happens is these habits that we develop have a purpose. But here's what's interesting. There's the biggest percentage of our subconscious way of turning up in the world is primarily unbeneficial, doesn't have any benefit at all. Okay, so let's have a look at the way in which the mind functions. Okay, so there's essentially three core, but I sort of have a fourth one there, ways in which the brain engages. The first is through thinking, and so that's the mechanism of what most of what the brain does. But it's able to experience or give to experiences feelings and sensations. Now, sensations are when we experience pain in the body or when we experience pleasure, or it's our nerve responses in terms of how they're responding to what's going on. And then finally, the third way in which the brain functions is through perceptions. So touch, taste, sight, sound, and smell. So in other words, we encounter this reality of life. So here's a sort of a kaleidoscope of a whole lot of different things that we might come across. And we're engaging all of these things, thinking, feeling, sensing, and perceiving. We're engaging them through those. So we have thoughts about these things. You know, I've just had I live in a rainforest up in the Bunya Mountains in Queensland, and I'm right in the middle of a rainforest. And for the last 3 weeks, I've had three pythons, three different ones, and very large pythons around my house. And some people, their thinking is No, don't want to have anything to do with it. I sort of put a Facebook post up, and one of the people went, no, 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 several times. That's all they said. It was like so. Here we have a combination of thinking and feeling that's being associated with the snake, and of course, arachnophobia. You don't have arachnophobia living up here either because there's lots of spiders. And so these are all the sorts of things that we're encountering where we're using our thinking, feeling, and perceiving to relate to the experience. But here's the interesting thing. We all have tinted glasses that we wear, and what those tinted glasses do is distorts what we see. So, in other words, it's a little bit like if you can imagine white snow and you're wearing yellow tinted glasses and you're going to be going, well, the snow's yellow. And everyone else is going, no, 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 it's red. And somebody else goes, no, it's green. And somebody else says, no, it's white. So what happens is that's how we approach life, is that we have this filter, and this filter then distorts reality. And so all of a sudden, somebody looks at a spider and they'd love to pick it up, whereas somebody else looks at it and they'll run a mile. Somebody else looks at a cigarette and they're craving a cigarette, and somebody else is offended by it. Somebody loves having hot coffee, and somebody else, in a religious tradition that doesn't drink coffee, won't have it. You see, what happens is we have all of these objective realities outside of us, and as the subject, through whatever coloured tinted glasses we're wearing, we actually distort the reality. Now, there's a whole lot to this because it basically says that to some extent we're manifesting our reality, certainly the way in which we perceive it, by virtue of the way in which we've been programmed. So let's take a moment to look at this. There's the story told of a young woman who's standing watching her mother prepare a lamb roast, and before her mother puts the roast into the oven, she cuts the end of the roast back, and then puts it in the oven. And her daughter's kind of curious about this and says to her mum, "Why did you do that? Why did you cut the end off the end of the roast like that?" And mum went, "Oh, well, that's something that my mum always did. And so it's something, that's just been a part of what I've done." And the girl said, "So do you know why she did it?" And the mother goes, "Well, I don't actually. I just know. I just thought it was part of how to cook a roast." So they decided to phone grandma and find out what um, was going on, and gave grandma a ring and sort of said, "Hey, you cut the end of a lamb roast. Why do you do that?" And she goes, "Oh, the reason I cut the end off the lamb roast was it was too big for my oven. And so for it to fit in there, I had to cut the end off it." So here we have a situation. Here's a perfect example where grandma's doing a functional thing in order to be able to cook a lamb roast. It's what was needed. Mum saw it being done, never bothered to ask what it was about, but developed an awareness that this is how you cook a lamb roast. And so here she is, probably 50 years on, still cooking the lamb roast like that, not realizing that, in fact, her oven is well and truly big enough to be able to take the whole roast, as opposed to the roast with the bit cut off. Didn't need that cut off at all. So what we have is this whole thing of programming that basically sets us up to relate to the experiences of life based on that program. Aristotle had a saying where he said, "Give me a boy until he is 7, and I'll give you the man." And basically, what this is saying is that most of our programming, in terms of how we relate through our mind, through our feelings and senses, and how we relate through our perceptions, has been programmed by the age of 7. And of course, all you've got to do is just watch these little children and watch how much they mimic the things that we say and the things that we do and how we express or turn up in the world emotionally. Because there's only one way that they get to know that in the early days, and that's through being able to observe what's going on. Of course, with time, they have experience. And so, in addition to what they have learnt through their programming, they also have their own personal experience. But um, it's no surprise that many of the things that they experience are a direct reflection of their program anyway. And so it's not, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, as they say. So what we've got is this situation where we have a whole lot of, as I said, thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes and feelings and perceptions that have been programmed into us and become the basis of how we live life in many cases until the day we die. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time, but I just thought I would share with you a little bit about how that looked for me. So this is the photo, top left photo is me of an 8-year-old with my dad. And then down the bottom there, that's me in my early 60s with my mum, who both of my parents have passed on. And the other photo there is me as a 17-year-old in Sydney. So the reason I've got the photo with my dad is that I was raised in the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, and my dad was my minister, and this is me the day I was getting baptized in would it be November 1966? That would be, and so I was raised within the Mormon culture with a whole lot of beliefs about um, how you turn up in the world, how you relate to other people, um, um, how you relate to um, diet and nutrition. Well, limited in a limited way because, as many of you might know, Mormons don't smoke or drink alcohol. They don't drink tea or coffee, and that was my reality. In fact, I can say that I didn't have my first alcoholic beverage until I was in my 40s, and I didn't smoke anything until I was in my 60s. Um, and so that's how strong those influences can be. So I sort of had this really huge association with um, a framework that was very, very much accommodated by religion. I want to say that there were some really positive sides to that as well, because my dad was a committed and devoted family man, and he was committed to community service. But oftentimes as a teenager, my younger brother and I, it was only 14 months between us, we'd go fishing every second Saturday at least out on Wilkes Creek or the Condamine River with my dad on a Saturday afternoon after we'd worked like navvies around the yard with mowing and gardening and all the things that we did. And so family values was something that was very, very strongly part of that programming. Now, down the bottom there, I've got my mum. And my mum was very, very interested in natural therapies, and so much so. But here's the interesting thing, is that her mother was into natural therapies in the most amazing, interesting times, which is during the 40s and the 50s, long before natural therapies was even popular. I can remember as a 6-year-old going and watching my grandma in the valley having a massage at an osteopathic centre there, or an osteopathic style centre that was in the valley in Brisbane. And I can remember sitting, smelling the camphor in the massage oil and watching her being slapped while they did topotement. And I can remember my little 6-year-old mind going, why would you want somebody to hit you like that? And so I was exposed to natural therapies, tissue salts, biochemic tissue salts. My mum had a full array of those in the pantry, and if we ever got sick, we'd have to go and get a Mag Foss or go and get a Nat Mur or something like that out of the pantry. My sandwiches for school used to be homemade bread out of whole grain. It was like door stoppers, and I'd have like sliced apple with grated carrot and cheese and sultanas, and that'd be everyone else would have Vegemite and peanut butter and honey, and I'm and on white bread, and I'm desperate to want to swap because not many people are interested in my sandwiches. Um, but I was also exposed to chiropractic originally and then osteopathy, and I became very interested in osteopathy, and so much so that the osteopath that I was visiting said, "Why don't you come down during your school holidays and I'll teach you osteopathic massage." And so from the age of 15, I went to Toowoomba, and during my school holidays, I'd go and work for the osteopath, and I would do massage from 6 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock at night, 5 days a week, and that's how I learned. And he said, "You've got a gift, go and do something about it." So I then went and studied natural therapies. Now, to add a whole nother dimension to this, I also had ADD, inattentive ADD. And so I had this ability to be scattered, and I wasn't sort of hyperactive, but there was certainly a lot about me that had me in a situation where I was quite different to everybody else. Now, what was interesting was that all of these things had me develop a narrative around being different. That being in a church like the Mormon Church, and you go to a Dolby, went to Dolby State High School, and all of a sudden, everybody else is in senior, everybody else is going to parties, and all sorts of things are going on, which I did none of that sort of stuff. And then the fact that I had ADD, how I managed to survive school was the school plays. If I hadn't had theatre and the ability to get involved in theatre, I wouldn't have survived high school. It was the thing that sort of allowed me to be able to stay there because of my ADD. And I think it was partly the ADD that got me channeled into doing massage with the osteopath, and then pursuing a career. And when I left school, I went on to pursue a career in natural therapies and became very successful in my own right, in terms of what I did there. But even back then, being in natural therapies, I was a fringe dweller because back in the 70s, it wasn't particularly popular in Australia. Also, being within the Mormon church and being a natural, I became a fringe dweller within the Mormon church because not everyone was into natural therapies, even within that. And so I sort of sat on the periphery. And of course, being with ADD, you sit on the periphery. So these were all of the things that basically had me come to this place where I experienced life from the periphery. And of course, what happens is, I end up, this becomes my filter, is this, excuse me a second, I just want to go back to that again, if I can. Um, so here I end up with my filter. And so these become my yellow tinted glasses, is the fact that I'm a fringe dweller. And of course, the problem with becoming a fringe dweller is isolation or not inclusive, rejection, and those sorts of things. And of course, part of what went on for me was I worked out that if I could become an intellectual pioneer. I was a para academic. I didn't, my studies back in the days that I was studying weren't under university or college training. It was they were private colleges, and so I was a para academic. But I had this ability to pioneer thought and come up with ideas, and be a leader in my thinking, and that gave me inclusion and acceptance because of my ability to do that. But what ended up happening was I ended up creating a vision of the world where I perceived that I was a fringe dweller. And so this is what we do, is that we all end up with our different various tinted glasses that basically bring a filter to the way in which we relate to our experience as a human being, and more especially in terms of how we function in our mind, how we function in our feelings and senses, and how we function in our perceptions. And of course, that then has a huge influence on how we engage relationships with friends and family and society. And so, what we have, all of us have a narrative that we've developed. And this is just a little sort of quick opportunity for you to see how my particular narrative got to play out. Um, and of course, what ends up happening is in order to survive in the world with those filters that are in place, we then use our habitual ways of turning up in life, but they're habits that have been formulated by our particular filter. Okay, so let's have a look at these states of consciousness, and in a minute there'll be an opportunity for you to write some things down. So 5% of the time we're making conscious choices. In other words, we're aware of what we're doing. And so the question I'm asking here is, what was the recent conscious decision that you made? So, for example, one that I made just recently, and I do this generally at least once, and sometimes I do 40-day fast twice a year, but I started a 40-day fast um, right at the end of beginning of March, sorry, maybe even end of February. I can't remember what date it was, but leading up to Easter, and so that was a very conscious decision to do that. Just recently, we've had lots and lots and lots of rain up here, and we've had 200 mils actually just over the last couple of weeks. And so I decided it was cool enough, but I decided as I said, I live in the mountains, so I lit my fireplace to help reduce dampness because I live in the middle of a rainforest. I can have a lot of trouble with mold if I don't get on top of the dampness. So that was a conscious choice to light my fire. Another one is to use the to-do app. For all the years that I didn't have that, I often would write things down, but there's such a wonderful little thing called a to-do app. And let me tell you, because of my ADD, I use it all the time. It's something that I'm constantly in. It's only just recently in the last 12 months that I made the conscious decision to include that. So have a moment just to think, just write them down. What have been recent conscious decisions that you've made? Not habitual, but something sort of out of the ordinary where you made a decision to to consciously do something. Okay. So 33% is subconscious decisions that are beneficial. Okay, so these are things that we do habitually that serve us. So once again, in this activity, identify some of your beneficial habits. So a habit that I have now is I leave the bonnet of my car up at night. So where I live in the rainforest, there's lots of native rodents up here, and they have a habit of jumping into a car at night time because it's protected and it could even be a bit warm if you've just driven. And they like to clear up any space around where they are, and they eat cables. And so what happens is your car can become basically undrivable because they've damaged the electrical cabling. And what the locals up here have worked out is if they leave their bonnet up at night, the mice don't nest in their motors. And so every night now I have this, it's a habit. Every time I pull up, I pull the lever so I can put the bonnet up each night. Obviously, the other ones are not everybody does this, but I wash up every day. I have this thing that every day that whatever's in the sink gets washed up. I do my washing weekly. Whenever that's totally possible. Once again, it's a very it's a habit, but it has to have some level of consciousness about it because I live off grid. And so I've got to be careful when I do my washing. But the habit of washing every week is something that I do. When I do it is a conscious choice. So there's a mixture on that one. So once again, I'll give you a minute just to take a moment to reflect on what are some of the beneficial habits that you do. Obviously, brushing your teeth, drinking water. There's lots of them, but I'm just wondering if you can think of any that you might be doing. Which leaves us with the subconscious non-beneficial decisions. So I'm going to get you to identify some of your non-beneficial habits. So one of my non-beneficial habits is a daily coffee. I don't know that it's doing the right thing by me, but it's become a habit and it's something that I enjoy. Now, here's an interesting thing is that part of my Lent fast, I decided to minimize my coffees, but more importantly, decided to go for caffeine free if I do have a coffee. And so that was one of the conscious choices that I made about that non-beneficial habit. I have a habit of not taking my shoes off at the door. Now, fortunately, I live in my own house, which means that I have to deal with the dirty floors um, in my place. So it's um, something that I have to clean up and deal with. And in the past, cravings for sweets and carbs was very habitual for me. And once again, it's something that I've become much more aware of in terms of not having sweets and carbs as um, it's pretty rare in terms of me sort of going to those things in terms of refined carbs. But these are the sorts of things that we have as our habitual behaviours, and I'm sure you can think of many more non-beneficial habits that you have in terms of shower routines. I mean, to some extent, they will have a benefit, but a lot of it's just programming. I how you hang your clothes on the line. It's I've got a habit around that based on how my mother did it, and that's how I do my clothes. My mum used to fold socks a certain way, and all of my socks are folded that way. Now, look, they to me they have benefits, but to other people, they would say that it takes too much time. And so it's not particularly beneficial because it's taking extra time that they don't want to spend on their washing and their socks, for example. So what we have is a life where through the activities of the mind, through thinking, through feeling and sensing and perceiving, um, we actually engage the mind through the filters of our program to experience life. And here's what happens is based on that programming, it has a huge influence on the degree to which we function consciously, beneficially subconsciously, or non-beneficially subconsciously. So in other words, even the way in which we engage these things is being directed primarily by um, our narrative and the way in which we have been programmed to perceive that we function in the world. So what I want to do now, before we go there, yes. Um, so the top one is about bringing fulfillment. So fulfillment is happiness. Fulfillment is that sense of enjoyment, that sense of getting the most out of life. And so these things, generally when we're making conscious decisions because we have a sense that they're going to bring us our greatest joy by doing these things. Um, In terms of the subconscious, what we're doing is we're reducing our stress by virtue of making beneficial decisions around. Now, that can also be associated with the conscious decisions, but basically it's about reducing stress. And then the main reason for non-beneficial decisions is that it's an easy option. When we just function totally habitually and not relying on having to think about anything, it's an easy option, and it doesn't take effort. And for a lot of us, effort takes energy, and we just don't have that energy. Let's talk a little bit about why we suffer. In the Buddhist tradition, it was taught in the Four Noble Truths that we suffer because of our attachments. The path to the cessation of suffering was the Noble Eightfold Path. In the Christian tradition, it was taught that the end of suffering came through seeking first the kingdom of God, and the path of cessation of suffering was the Beatitudes, which is another eightfold path, interestingly enough. Buddha taught that there were three states of consciousness that made change difficult, if not impossible. And these were called the three poisons, and it was ignorance, avoidance, and attachment. Now, interestingly enough, in the Christian tradition, Jesus taught the same three poisons in his parable of the sower. He talked about a farmer planting seeds and how some seeds fall on the unturned soil, so the seeds can't even get in the soil. That's ignorance. Some amongst rocky soil, so there's rocks, but the seeds get down in there, but the roots couldn't get established, and that was avoidance. And then he talked about the seeds that fell amongst the weeds, where they would all grow and the weeds would choke out the established plants from those seeds that they'd planted, and that was called attachment. And so getting a very clear understanding of these three poisons being responsible for our suffering is important. You can't change what you can't see. And that's why we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at this, because we suffer when joy, peace, and happiness aren't a part of our experience. When joy, peace, and happiness is our experience, we don't suffer. It's one or the other. Um, of course, unless you associate pleasure with suffering, which some people do. But for the majority of us, it's not in that particular setup. Okay. Ignorance is when you live life habitually, always doing what you've always done, meaning you'll always get what you've always got. Typically, you are unaware of why you do what you do. It's living on autopilot or subconsciously, which are other words for habitually. Autopilot is an easy way to engage life, but how has that worked for you? So let's just look at this in summary. So what does it look like? You live life habitually, unaware that life could be done differently. Okay, so this is just you wake up, you go through your morning routine, your breakfast routine, you go to work, you come home, you do the jobs around the house, you do your shower and things that you do, you go to bed, you sleep, you wake up, and we just have this routine. One that, and I'm going to be focusing on this one, is your diet is informed by your upbringing and advertising. So invariably, what happens is your programming around your diet. Now, it has one of two impacts. You either fully align with it or you rebel against it, but it's still being informed by your diet. And of course, advertising in this day and age has a huge impact, and fast food has become a significant part of our culture. And Uber Eats and all these other things that are going on, that people are able to access food that's now, not all of it's fast food, but a lot of it is, and that's become an advertising, and convenience and ease is how we then end up functioning. The impact is that we experience diseases brought about by poor eating habits. And of course, the remedy is to treat the symptoms of those diseases. So, for example, when indigestion or obesity have become insufferable, and generally, of course, for most of us, we actually wait until we're hurting because we don't know anything else. We've become so absorbed in our habitual way of living that we're not taking on new information. And so the only thing that wakes us up is suffering. And of course, the conscious remedy is our acknowledging of our ignorance and seeking to expand knowledge and understanding. So, in other words, the way in which we are able to move beyond the limitations of ignorance is to get expanded understanding. So, once again, a little activity for you here is to write down when you have lived your life in ignorance. So, what are things that you've done that have been a fair indication that you were unaware, that you were in a state of ignorance where you were doing what you've always done based on your programming and it's habitual and you're going through that routine. And I'm sure all of you have had moments of that. Okay, avoidance. Avoidance is where new knowledge has been gathered. So you've been living life in ignorance, and all of a sudden you've been made aware that there's another way of doing things. So that eliminates ignorance, okay? But you choose not to act on the new knowledge, generally because it's too hard. And I like to think this is the no, 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 no. In other words, I don't want to hear it. I mean, I know that I've got to do something different because I'm hurting, but I don't want to hear it. And that's because it's going to take effort to make the changes. You either procrastinate or avoid making the changes that will stop your suffering. This is where the adage no pain, no gain is relevant. Pain and suffering are the gifts that are waking you up to the need to make better serving choices. And so this is a really important thing to be aware of, is that in fact our pain and suffering many times are gifts to help us become more aware. And in the Christian tradition, for example, Jesus, when he was giving his eightfold path to enlightenment, with the Beatitudes, and the first Beatitude is blessed are the poor in spirit. And that poor in spirit are people who have lost. Spirit is about motive and energy and drive. And I mean, it could have a spiritual context, but I see it in the context of that. And poor in spirit are people who have lost that get up and go, and they're hurting, they're suffering, they're in that point of pain. And interesting enough, in that Beatitude, Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. He's actually saying this is a gift. Let's find out more about that later. So here's what it looks like. You know what's needed to improve things, but you don't follow through. So you're suffering, you've been made aware of what you need to do, but you avoid it as long as you can. For example, you're obese. Your health is severely compromised, but don't act. Okay, and it's an issue that we're seeing, particularly here in Australia. We're seeing a lot of obesity, and people's health is being compromised, and it would appear that many of them aren't making choices to have it be different. Um, some are, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but a lot aren't. The impact, your quality of life suffers, and there is the potential for serious illness. The remedy resorts to addictions or pleasure to mask or ignore your suffering. So we'll actually go to all sorts of things to be able to not have to deal with the pain of what we're dealing with. And it'll be some sort of, as I said, and this is consumerism, this could be sex, this could be, in some cases, it could be exercise, it could be playing a sport, could be your work. There's lots of ways that people play out addictions. And then the conscious remedy, you become the observer of your experiences, physical, mental, and emotional. So the conscious remedy of changing avoidance is through becoming the observer. And once again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Write down and discuss times when you chose to avoid making necessary changes. I'm sure you've all done it. We've all done it, I think, probably at one time or another. So see if you can think of the time when you did that and just jot that down. Which brings us to attachment. Attachment is not being able to sustain changes that you know are better. For example, overweight people on the dieting roller coaster ride, weight off, weight back on, weight off, weight back on. Typically, willpower and discipline are not sustainable. It's like watching a movie you don't particularly like and deciding you'll change the movie. So you change the screen, as that is where you see the movie. What needs changing is the reel on the projector, in other words, the mind. So what does it look like? You're motivated to change, you make the changes, but keep failing. Example, you attempt many diets, lose weight, then put it back on again. All those New Year resolutions. I mean, it's almost like a global joke about the fact that by the time we get to March, most New Year resolutions have passed their use by date. And this is a classic example. The impact your obesity is compounded by shame and guilt of failure. And of course, what often happens many times is that they resort to eating in order to deal with their shame and guilt, and they put on more weight than what they had beforehand. The remedy, bariatric surgery or Ozempic. So in other words, we find ways or interventions that are beyond our conscious control, that are able to bring about an impact in terms of, Ozempic minimizing our appetite and our desire to eat food, bariatric surgery reducing the size of the stomach or creating limitations to food getting into the stomach so that we consume less. So in other words, the idea is using some external form of interruption to the amount of food that's being consumed. Okay, the conscious remedy, commit to being aware by living your life mindfully. So this becomes the way in which you're able to bring about this sort of change. And it seems almost ridiculous that awareness and mindfulness has a greater capacity for sustainable change compared to will and discipline. And I would suggest to you that there's a huge amount of truth to that. And it's certainly been my experience in the years. And this is my own personal experience. I want to share with you, this is me. Oh, before we get there, sorry, please write down or discuss times where you have struggled with attachment, where you've tried to get into the habit of doing something. It might be stop smoking, or could be alcohol or drugs. It could be food. It could be consumerism. There's lots of things that it could be where you've struggled and you find yourself reverting back to your old behaviours. This is me when my life was governed by ignorance, avoidance, and attachment. And I can tell you that all of these relate in one form or another to those three having been my reality. Um, at my worst, which I think is probably the second photo on the left, I was 146 kg. I was a pretty large man at that particular point. And I went through that whole thing where the number of diets that I did for years and years and years, was all um, futile in the end. I'd lose the weight, look fantastic, and then something would happen. And of course, the something that happens, of course, is our narrative. It's our childhood narrative. And mine is about being a fringe dweller. And so it was probably something that sort of really brought to light the fact that I sat on the periphery, that I was a fringe dweller, that resulted in me being in this place of suffering. And of course, for me, because I was raised a Mormon, I didn't smoke and I didn't drink and I didn't do drugs. So the easiest place for me to go was to revert to or resort to eating, and that became my coping mechanism during that time. However, once I became aware and mindful of the choice to be more self-loving, then a whole different man was manifested and created. And these are images from me over the last well, the one on the left was the Camino in 2011, and so these photos are of me from sort of 2010 onwards, so for the last 15 years. And as much as I had the knowledge and had the understanding of what awareness and being mindful of the choices were about, it was intellectual. It wasn't something that I had integrated into my being. And so it took a while to be able to integrate that knowledge and understanding such that I was able to have it become a manifesting reality in my experience. And that's essentially my own personal experience that sits behind the work that I do. The Pathways to Mindfulness program that I use, where I help guide people through this ability to live life with awareness and being mindful of self-loving choices. It's come from a very personal experience. This was about my reality and what I've been through, and the things that I teach, I got to adopt, and were the things that I did in order to bring about my healing. Okay, so generally, our suffering is brought about by ignorance, avoidance, and attachment. And the thing that sets up ignorance, avoidance, and attachment in our experience is our yellow tinted glasses. It's the filters from our programming that have us engage life in the way that we do. And so this is all connected as we're going through and introducing these pieces. So let's just jump on the other side of the equation for a moment and let's talk about awareness and what is awareness. So what we have is mental awareness, or awareness in the mind, and that's about knowledge. So when we have knowledge, we're then aware of, or we are more conscious of what's going on in our world. So with little children, they don't know that if you touch a radiator, a heater, you can burn your finger. So they're ignorant of that until they gain knowledge. Now, knowledge can come through experience. If they touch it, they now know not to touch it, or they can be told. In other words, they can be formed or made aware by virtue of the fact that mum and dad explains to the child that you have to avoid touching this, otherwise it hurts. And so reading these days, YouTube, but more importantly, there's all sorts of mediums where on our computers and of course through education institutions. So the more aware we become, or through the mind, is through the accumulation of knowledge. Um, and and probably with a hint of understanding with that. In our state of consciousness, now, I want to differentiate between these. I don't know if you've ever done meditation, but there's the experience of meditation is that you're able to become the observer of your thinking. So it's one thing to be caught up in your thinking. It's another thing to step back and observe that you're thinking. And this is what we call becoming conscious. Okay, this has nothing to do with knowledge. This is about becoming conscious of how we're thinking, conscious of what we're feeling, and conscious of what we're perceiving. And all of a sudden, this goes from a noun to a verb. And being conscious is the state of knowing an experience. So knowledge, so the mind is about the accumulation of knowledge. Consciousness is the experience of knowing. So it's not about information, it's not about knowledge, but it's knowing. So, for example, you might eat something that's very delicious, and in that moment you're sitting there and you're going, yum. When you say yum, that's a state of knowing. It's an experience of consciousness because it's in the state of knowing the experience of yum. Okay. If we were to, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but if we were to say, I am happy, there's the experience of happy, but we're in the state of knowing because we've said I am. When we use the words I am, it's a state of consciousness because it's saying, I know that I'm happy. I am in the state of knowing happiness. And so these are two different states of awareness. Consciousness knowing is a mechanism for healing, where the knowledge associated with the mind is about management of experience, and in some cases has the capacity to be able to have us lead healthier lives. But as we will talk a little bit later on, consciousness brings about a form of healing that the mind can't achieve in the same way. In the Christian tradition, and I think to me this is probably one of the most important scriptures, and I don't wish to offend anybody, but you notice that I reverence much of the Buddhist tradition and much of the Christian tradition. These days, I'm not a devotee to a religion, but I have a reverence for wisdom. And I think this is one of the more profound scriptures of wisdom in the New Testament. And this is where the concept of a Western approach to mindfulness was inspired by. If you can see with your eyes, hear with your ears, and understand with your heart. So these are three states of awareness where you're being the observer. You're conscious of what's going on with your eyes, with your ears, and with your heart. And if you can become committed to this, Jesus goes on to say, I will heal you. So we've got this really profound message where it says that if you can become the observer, that which is aware, then healing can happen. And of course, the kind of healing is really interesting when you look at the etymology of the word health. The word health, heal, comes from the Old English words hal, which is hail, in other words, hello, or whole, or halig, which is holy and sacred. And literally, the word health is the idea of oneness. In other words, when something is connected whole, holy, or sacred, it's a state of oneness that we're experiencing. So literally the type of healing that I think was being referred to in Matthew 13:15 that came as a result of being the observer with your eyes, ears, and with your heart, the healing that comes with that is a spiritual healing, is a divine healing. And it's the ultimate healing where we get to connect with those qualities of peace, love, and joy as a way of life. So, what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is remembering in each moment that you have a choice to be kinder to yourself, to others, and to the planet. So I'm just going to go over that one again. So what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is remembering in each moment that you have a choice to be kinder to yourself, to others, and to the planet. Okay, so in order to have a choice, you have to have knowledge. So in other words, unless you have information that gives you a choice, you're going to remain ignorant or you're going to be in attachment. So in other words, you've forfeited choice by ignoring it, or you're not aware by just completely being ignorant of it. And so you have to have knowledge and understanding. So you have to have that level of awareness where you have an understanding of what the alternatives would be in each moment. And of course, more specifically, this is about having an awareness or understanding or knowledge about what it takes to be kinder to yourself, to others, and to the planet. And so this might incorporate things like social justice, helping the needy, um, being aware of when you can make a difference to other people's suffering, for example. It may be to help um, bring about healing through forgiveness and learning to have a commitment to in A Course of Miracles, it says forgiveness is selective remembering. And so it's having a commitment to remember that you have the choice when a comes to shove moment, that you have the choice to seek to understand what's going on with this other person. We never really know what's going on. And so it's about selectively remembering the experience of what's going on. Doesn't deny it, but it's choosing to have a different context for it. And then, of course, to the planet, which is about Mother Nature, Mother Earth, and the choices that we're making in terms of how we turn up here on the planet. And once again, it's about having knowledge and information in terms of the fact that we have a choice there. Okay, so what we're going to have a look at now is what's required to bring about change so that change can be sustainable.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, that it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true. The brain can and does change throughout our lives. It is adaptable, like plastic. Hence, neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. How does neuroplasticity work? If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, there are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well traveled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say we think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. We start carving out a new road. If we keep traveling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and less and weakens.
This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action. The good news is that we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. If you have ever changed a bad habit or thought about something differently, you have carved a new pathway in your brain and experienced neuroplasticity firsthand. With repeated and directed attention towards your desired change, you can rewire your brain.
So what we have is this capacity, and how lovely that we have the research and the understanding of how the brain functions, that we now understand this concept of neuroplasticity, and that we're able to bring about this change in this way by basically developing a reprogramming. Now, here's what I think is just incredibly fascinating is that, 2,000 years ago, Jesus in that scripture says, if you can see with your eyes, hear with your ears, and understand with your heart, I will heal you. This is the healing. This change in the neural pathway is the healing. And it comes about by being committed to being the observer. So the more and more you have the capacity to observe the kinder or loving alternative, what we have is that the more we do it, all of a sudden we start to find ourselves functioning in alignment with that. So when kindness becomes your new habit, peace, love, and joy become your new way of life. And so what you have is this amazing capacity to be able to, through practicing a process of how you engage your thinking through being mindful and aware, you're able to have peace, love, and joy literally be your modus operandi. And what happens is you become less and less exposed to the stresses that cause suffering. It doesn't mean that stresses don't happen, but where you might dwell on something for weeks or months, in some cases, even in some cases, years, with this new level of consciousness, you might dwell on it for 2 minutes. And then you come back to your place of peace and love and joy as a way of life. So that's what we're all about. That's what I'm all about, is that I've developed a beautiful program, and it's called Pathways to Mindfulness, and this is the workbook that we have. And as you can see, it's a very, very well structured, and it becomes a tool that you can hang on to and refer to in years to come. It can be a reference point. And I know many of the people that I've worked with will often go back and once or twice a year go back through that and reacquaint themselves with some of the mindfulness tools or some of the observations in terms of where they've been, in order to bring themselves back into maintaining that awareness that they're wanting to have as a way of life. So Pathways to Mindfulness, that program is a 5-module one-on-one mentoring program, and it's designed to help you to create a way of life that is about peace, love, and joy. That's what it's all about. So by learning to understand the profound nature of awareness and mindfulness, you can create a reality of healing by just being aware. Here's what makes what we do different to coaching, for example. This program doesn't require you to muster personal will and discipline. So you're not being asked, we come up with, for example, strategies in terms of how to move from your current state of not being aware to maintaining mindfulness as a way of life. And you come up with these strategies. At no stage do we ask you to actually adopt the strategies. Your primary shift is being mindful of the choice to be kind. So the whole notion or approach to what we do in terms of having you have these become part of your neural reality is to have you just observe them. Pick it up and read it, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. Or, there's put it on the fridge where you can see it. I mean, there's lots of different things that we recommend and strategies that you can come up with. And of course, most of this is about you coming up with the strategies. We talk about what the mechanism is and help you understand the process. You decide the way to do it. I don't do that when I'm working with you. And so what this whole process is about is being able to take you on this journey of learning how to live your life in awareness, with the natural result being peace, love, and joy as your day-to-day experience. Can you even fathom the possibility of that could be a reality? Some of you might already have it. Some of you may have moments of it, but it gets taken away. And what we're suggesting is it's possible for that to become more and more of a reality. Now, one of the things that we're offering, and you're going to receive notice of this in an email after we're finished here, and there'll be an invitation for you to be able to do a personal complimentary, it's a one-on-one with me online, where I will take you through the second part of what we call exploring awareness. And in this one, we actually get you to take a very intimate and personal look at who you are mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. So if you have a look at those questionnaires on the left there, for example, with the physical one, which is the green one, I regularly exercise in a way that supports my well-being. Now, you're either aware of that, you're not aware of it, or you're somewhat aware of it in terms of relating to it. And awareness would equate to engagement. I often participate in outdoor activities. I often take time to be playful with others. I'm responsible with my personal finances. So there's some examples of the physical one. Here's the spiritual one. I'm clear about the things I value most. My week includes regular personal reflective time. I make a concerted effort to be caring toward the planet. So once again, I go through these with you and we discuss them and give you an opportunity to identify whether you're mostly aware, somewhat aware, or not aware of these things. And then we go through and score your result. And then we have, like on the, let's have a look at if you're mostly unaware on the top right form there. Somebody who's mostly unaware does little to exercise the mind, i.e. learning, reading, mind games, limit censorship on media regarding time and content, very little original thought, thinking is mostly aligned to family and social programs, easily bored. Somebody who's somewhat aware actively participates in developing the mind, has an interest in exploring thinking that goes beyond their formative programming, are selective in the quality and quantity of the media they engage. Contemplation and meditation are important. And then somebody who's mostly aware maintains a constant awareness of one's thinking. Peace is their priority. Naturally choose to exercise and feed the mind in ways that maintain stillness. Understand they have thoughts but are not their thoughts. They are committed to awareness. So what we have is a sort of you've gone through, answered the questions, then you get to find out if how you answered them really fits who you are. And it becomes very evident whether or not you fit in one of those three. And so it's, as we said earlier on, you can't change what you can't see. And so this is the beginning of you beginning to observe what's going on for you. The other way that our program is designed is that these questions also give us 5 observations about characteristics of you. So the first one is personal development in terms of where you're at in working on you and developing you. Self-nurturance, how you're being nurturing to yourself. Personal well-being, how important your health is. Personal accountability, which is pretty obvious. And how socially integrated you are. And so once again, we're able to value add through those questions and get some other lovely deep insights into the nature of your current state of consciousness. And of course, that has relevancy, and part of what we do in this second part is establish how that's turning up in your life in terms of the quality of happiness or dissatisfaction or suffering that you're experiencing. So you're welcome to participate. It'll be about a 90-minute activity, and as I said, that's free of charge, and there's no obligation after you've completed it of any kind. It's an opportunity for you to really get a sense of what we're doing and a much deeper appreciation of the work that I do through my Pathways to Mindfulness program. So this is what you're going to be getting. You'll get that little image on the left-hand side in an email. You've already participated. It's my understanding that tonight's video of our session will be where that Western Mindfulness clip is with the start button on it. But beside it, or immediately below that, is the session 2, which is what I was just showing you about being able to explore your awareness with me one-on-one. And you can go and book that using that particular button there. It says book now, and that will bring you through onto a booking page with me where you can look at my calendar and find out a time that works for you and works for me, where we can participate in that activity. If there isn't a time there because you're overseas, don't hesitate to contact by email either the Centre for Western Mindfulness or me personally, russellsturgis@me.com, russellsturgis@me.com, if you want to book a time, because I can be quite flexible in terms of when I can catch up with you in that regard. So before we have our open discussion, I just have one little takeaway that I want to give you that is a really lovely little tool, and it's really quite powerful. And that is a full stop, or if you're in America, a period. One of the best ways to start practicing becoming the observer is to replace your commas with full stops or periods. So that what ends up happening when we have a situation and something happens, oftentimes we observe the experience, and instead of putting a full stop, we put a comma in, and then our yellow tinted glasses kick in, and we now give a meaning to the experience based on which particular coloured glasses we're wearing. And what it does, of course, is it has us reconnect with the suffering and the pain, or the other extreme of that, which is the excitement and the bliss that's associated with our particular narrative, because it either gave us the happiness we wanted or it resulted in suffering. And so when you come back to just using a full stop, what you're doing is you're stopping the use of the yellow tinted glasses. So what happens is a fact has occurred and you put a full stop and you become the observer of the fact. So you have this ability to be able to just recognize, and it could be a series of facts. The facts could include how you're feeling. It could include what actually happened without giving any of it a filtered meaning. You're just sticking with the facts. So this is really sort of entry level when you can see with your eyes and hear with your ears and understand with your heart. What you're doing is you're bringing a commitment to staying in the place of being the observer, which is made manifest through ears, eyes, and heart. And then, what was the promise? I will heal you. And I know that this sounds ridiculous, but in fact, if you had the ability to be totally committed to living your life in a state of awareness and mindfulness, in other words, to stick to the facts, that experience of peace, love, and joy would naturally become your experience. Now, some people can do that, not many. And for those of you who can't, what I have is this really lovely program where I can work with you to help you have that approach to life become a way of life that results in peace, joy, and love.